Welcome to Spontaneous Particulars, the Telepathy of Archives. A little over 100 years ago, Helen Keller published a series of essays called The World I Live In, which focused on the hand, on the etymology of the manus, from which, she reminds us, we derive the words manual, manufacture, manicule, manuscript, and on a practice of apprehending the world through touch, what Susan Howe might call my looking glass hands, and through the great discipline of vicinity and of vibratory intellection, which Keller says, quote, interthreads her reality with that of other corporeal and conceptual beings and phenomena. In an industrial age in which technologies were already abstracting that experience, her great mentor was, after all, Alexander Graham Bell. She was keenly aware of the potential loss of the tangible, intimate particulars. Tonight, a century later, we have the privilege of pondering these particulars yet again, this time in relationship to our own digital era and to libraries and archives, the very worlds in which so many of us here tonight have the privilege to live, and in which preservation and the palpable, aura and abstraction, the eternal and the temporal, the textual and textile, questions of handling and the handling of questions are forever at play. My role here tonight is to introduce the introducer, a bold and visionary young scholar from the University of Maine. Kristen Case has focused her more recent inquiries on Susan Howe, as well as on Thoreau and his meticulously maintained calendars, which have gone largely unstudied, Case believes, because literary scholars for so long perceived them as science, and scientists perceived them as poetry. Her experience with this liminal territory and her particular encounter with contemporary archives, in which her process has involved converting microfilms of Thoreau's minuscule scrawl to PDFs and then into her own handwritten transcriptions to be typewritten again, gives her a keen understanding, dare I say, a kind of telepathy, if telepathy is a feeling from afar, of Susan Howe's compelling and essential subject matter tonight. Please welcome Kristen Case, who will introduce Susan Howe.
I am surprised and moved by that lovely introduction. Thank you, Christina. Can you hear me okay with the mic like that? Okay. Thank you, first of all, to Christina Davis and the Woodberry Poetry Room for this extraordinary invitation. It's just a huge honor. And a wonderful event. I'm so looking forward to this talk. It means a great deal to me to be here tonight to introduce Susan Howe. At the heart of any intellectual life is a series of unpayable debts. The conventions of scholarly writing reflect a double wish to discharge and to suppress this sense of indebtedness. On the one hand, measuring it out in footnotes, on the other, perpetually urging on the fiction of self-authorship. The hands work together, or by turns, saying and unsaying debt, Penelope at her loom. I would like to use this occasion to speak single-handedly, first personally, of my unpayable debt to Susan Howe, in the faith that by doing so, I am speaking for more than myself and speaking to the generosity of her work, the absoluteness of its invitation, its opening of a space beyond the closed economy of the anxiety of influence. In recounting in the midnight another visit to Harvard, Howe describes the concordance of the Gospels produced at Little Gidding and housed at the Houghton Library reading room. She quotes Eliot's poem, "Sense and notion, you are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity, or carry report. You are here to kneel, where prayer has been valid. And prayer is more than an order of words." This quotation is followed by Howe's reflection, I wonder what would happen if I suddenly knelt down here before the case. It is for her reinstatement of devotion as a motive for the acts of attention we call poetry and scholarship that I feel perhaps most indebted to Howe. Her evocation of the way in which, in spite of a host of formidable physical and conventional barriers, an intensely personal relation to other earlier acts of writing may not only persist, but may become itself a subject and a method of both poetry and of scholarship. Howe's acts of collage and of juxtaposition, of marginalia and of philosophical trespass do indeed, as many critics have pointed out, speak to us of the possibilities and limitations of language. But to me, they speak more urgently of a certain kind of normally suppressed devotion, of the way the movement of a body and the gestures of a mind in writing words may be reanimated by the kind of love that haunts an archive. Against the boundaries set by an entrenched view of scholarship as verification, as instruction and carrying report, Howe's acts of trespass mark out a space for scholarship, for writing as act of love. All who read must cross the divide, one from the other. Toward whom am I floating? I'll tie a rope around your waist if you say who you are. Remember, we are traveling as relations. That's from the Midnight. Corresponding to this origin in devotion, Howe's writing works toward the recognition and the rendering visible of all forms of relation. To cite only one example, her work on Emily Dickinson is also about Robert Browning, the Brontes, Charles Dickens, Mary Rowlandson, Shakespeare, Cotton and Increase Mather, Jonathan Edwards, and Susan Howe, among others. In Peirce Arrow, quotations from Pope's translation of the Iliad prompt an association with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, whose letters to a young contributor in the Atlantic Monthly encouraged writers to present neat manuscripts and made a negative example of the paper-sparing Pope. Higginson, Emily Dickinson's longtime correspondent, becomes a bridge between Dickinson and Charles Sanders Peirce, both marginalized figures whose stubbornly idiosyncratic manuscripts editors have repressed and sanitized beyond recognition. Arisbe is both a colony mentioned in the Iliad and the name of Peirce's tragic estate in Milford, Pennsylvania. The train of associations here, as I have noted in the margin of my copy of Peirce Arrow, is Peirce, Arisbe, Homer, Pope, Higginson, Dickinson. Of course, these terms may be reconfigured in any direction, as the associations are always multiple and always moving. Howe may be added between almost any two of the terms in this chain. Her description of reading Peirce's papers on microfilm viewers at the beginning of Peirce Arrow recalls her early experience with microfilm, recounted in the Europe of Trusts. During World War II, my father's letters were a sign he was safe. A miniature photographic negative of his handwritten message was reproduced by the Army and a microfilm copy forwarded to us. In the top left-hand corner, someone had always stamped, "Passed by examiner." The relational space, Howe writes, is the thing that is alive with something from somewhere else. In making relations, especially the normally suppressed or marginalized relations, private relations, not only the subject of her writing, but also a governing principle of its construction, Howe invites us into the making of the poem. The constellations we make in her pages will be at least in part our own, drawn from our own marginalia, our own life somewhere else. This permission, the permission to enter the space of the poem as one of the terms in its networks of relation, was for me an event that changed the meaning of reading and writing and made possible my own work. I have not spoken explicitly about gender because I don't want to too narrowly define what I see as the limitless nature of this permission. But it is important to say that conventions of scholarly and poetic discourse remain both patriarchal and cripplingly Oedipal, largely a matter still of overthrowing fathers, of proving our competence and singularity and independence, of denying our relations. Against the background of this culture, Susan Howe's work announces another possibility: to use language not as a means of erasing the extra-textual world and our connections to it, but as a way to render visible and active the invisible web of relations that animates and informs our every act of reading and writing and thinking, as a means itself of relation, of love. It is a possibility we need. Susan Howe is the author of more than a dozen books of poetry and 2 of literary criticism. Her recent collection of poems, This, published by New Directions, won the Bollingen Prize in 2011. She has released 3 CDs in collaboration with the musician-composer David Grubbs. Howe held the Samuel P. Capon Chair in Poetry and the Humanities at the State University of New York at Buffalo until her retirement in 2007. She was the recipient of many awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, and served as a chancellor to the Academy of American Poets between 2000 and 2006. In October 2013, her word collages were exhibited at the Yale Union in Portland, Oregon, and more recently at the Whitney Biennial. The text you will be presenting tonight, Spontaneous Particulars, The Telepathy of Archives, is published by Christine Bergen and New Directions, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I'm very pleased to welcome Susan Howe.
Thank you, Kristen. You just made everything worthwhile for me. I'm deeply moved. Thank you so much. And to think you're working on Thoreau. God. Anyway, just this first, there are handouts at the end. I don't want you to be peeking and saying, what is that? This is basically, I arranged these slides in a collage-like manner for to make my own connections. And, but I thought you might wonder about them at the end, but it would be awful if you sort of stopped experiencing them and then tried to see what they are. So that thing is just for later, okay? So this is, but I'm telling you this is the cover of Gertrude Stein, one of Gertrude Stein's notebooks. And those are her there were several notebooks called Sentences, and those are her notes on the cover of that kind of standard French school book. But I think that seagull is wonderful. Anyway, here we go. For this lecture, if it can be called a lecture, I've combined images from research libraries and special collections with my spoken written text, which I've just said to you, without supplying a narrative logic or stopping to identify each one, just allowing you to make your own connections. From start to finish in my poetry and criticism, the porous border between visual and verbal, sound and sight, has always been a primary concern, as it is in the work of poets and authors whose manuscripts, drafts, and doodles you see here. I won't stop either to identify many of the passages I quote, but I think it's clear that I am quoting from the people when I read them. So anyway, this is all one running thing. Electronic technologies, as they evolve, are radically transforming the way we read, write, and remember. The nature of archival research is in flux. The primary difference between our way of viewing and touching objects and documents, as opposed to merely viewing the same material on a monitor. Databases, computer-generated searches, the study of literature as a system, the recovery of keywords and related projects, it's all a brave new technological world. While I realize that profound changes have occurred and are occurring and continuing to provide myriad possibilities for artists, poets, academics, autodidacts, and librarians in terms of storage, access, and research, this lecture is a collaged swan song to the old ways. And I'm going to begin by reading, this I'm telling you, from the third section of William Carlos Williams' Patterson, the Library, which I adore and is very conflicted about libraries. A cool of books will sometimes lead the mind to libraries of a hot afternoon, if books can be found cool to the sense to lead the mind away. For there is a wind or ghost of a wind in all books, echoing the life there. A high wind that fills the tubes of the ear, until we think we hear a wind actual to lead the mind away. Drawn from the streets, we break off our mind's seclusion and are taken up by the book's winds, seeking down the wind, until we are unaware which is the wind and which the wind's power over us to lead the mind away. And there grows in the mind a scent, it may be, of locust blossoms, whose perfume itself is a wind moving to lead the mind away, through which below the cataract, soon to be dry, the river whirls and eddies. First recollected, spent from wandering the useless streets these months, faces folded against him like clover at nightfall, something has brought him back to his own mind, in which a falls unseen tumbles and rights itself and refalls and does not cease falling and refalling with a roar, a reverberation, not of the falls, but of its rumor unabated. Beautiful thing, my dove, unable, and all who are wind-blown touched by the fire and unable. A roar that soundless drowns the sense with its reiteration, unwilling to lie in its bed and sleep and sleep, sleep in its dark bed. In his legendary The H.D. book, a collection of essays, chapters, and meditations inspired by the life and writing of the poet Hilda Doolittle, that until 2011 only existed in photocopies and separate chapters in out-of-print little magazines or on hard-to-locate internet sites, Robert Duncan writes, "The secret of the poetic art lies in the keeping of time, to keep time designing or rediscovering lines of melodic coherence, counting the measures, marking them off, calculating sequences, the whole intensified in the poet's sense of its limitation. One image may recall another, finding depth in the resounding." Duncan also speaks of the romantic spirit, and back of that, the spirit of romance under boycott. He wrote this in 1961. The taboo is even more severe now. But I believe this currently exiled spirit, Keats' beauty is truth, truth beauty, Stevens' the giant body, the meaning of its folds, the weaving and the crinkling and the vex, Williams' beautiful thing aflame, and beauty is a defiance of authority. This visionary spirit, a deposit from a future yet to come, is gathered and guarded in the domain of research libraries and special collections. On June 20th, 1926, Hart Crane, then staying on his mother's family property on the Isle of Pines, Cuba, wrote to Waldo Frank while working on what he hoped would be his epic poem, The Bridge. "The form of my poem rises out of a past that so overwhelms the present with its worth and vision that I'm at a loss to explain my delusion that there exist any real links between that past and a future destiny worthy of it. The destiny is long since completed. Perhaps the little last section of my poem is a hangover echo of it, but it hangs suspended somewhere in ether, like an Absalom by his hair." That image, Absalom by his hair, is what makes Hart Crane such a great poet. Possibly during 1885, the year before she died, Emily Dickinson wrote in a letter to her sister-in-law, Susan, "Emerging from an abyss and re-entering it, that is life. Is it not, dear? The tie between us is very fine, but a hair never dissolves." Things in themselves and things as they are for us. Often by chance, via out-of-the-way card catalogs, or through previous web surfing, a particular deep text or a simple object bobbin, sampler, scrap of lace, reveals itself here at the surface of the visible by mystic documentary telepathy. Quickly, precariously, coming as it does from an opposite direction. If you are lucky, you may experience a moment before. The English word text comes from medieval Latin textus, style or texture of a work, literally thing woven, from the past participle stem of texere, to weave, to join, fit together, construct. In several notebooks she labeled sentences, you saw the cover of one, 1928 through 1929, Gertrude Stein writes, and these are all separate sentences, hers. A sentence is an imagined masterpiece. A sentence is an imagined frontispiece. What is the difference between a sentence and a sewn? What is the difference between a sentence and a picture? She obviously didn't like question marks. Those are just sentences. They will sew, which will make it a tapestry. A sentence is not carrying it away. A sentence furnishes while they will draw. A sentence is drawers and drawers full of drawings. In looking up from her embroidery, she looks up at me. She lifts up the tapestry. It is partly. I think that's the most perfect definition of a sentence. It is partly. Think in stitches. Think in settlements. Think in willows. An article by Edward Moore and Arthur Burks on editing the manuscripts of the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce has an epigraph taken from the horse's mouth. I am a mere table of contents, a very snarl of twine. In research libraries and collections, we may capture the portrait of history in so-called insignificant visual and verbal textualities and textiles, in material details, in twill fabrics, beadwork pieces, pricked patterns, tiny spangles, sharp-toothed stencil wheels, in quotations, thought fragments, rhymes, rebuses, syllables, graphemes, endangered phonemes, in soils and crossouts. In 1907, Henry James placed his second novel, Roderick Hudson, first in the 24-volume Scribner's New York collection of his novels, novellas, and short stories. Near the beginning of the preface he wrote for the edition, he asks, where, for the complete expression of one's subject, does a particular relation stop giving way to some other not concerned in that expression? Really, universally, relations stop nowhere, and the exquisite problem of the artist is eternally but to draw, by geometry of his own, the circle within which they shall happily appear to do so. All of which, this is still James, will perhaps pass but for a super-subtle way of pointing the plain moral that a young embroiderer of the canvas of life soon began to work in terror, fairly, of the vast expanse of that surface, of the boundless number of its distinct perforations of the needle, and of the tendency inherent in his many-colored flowers and figures to cover and consume as many as possible of the little holes. The development of the flower of the figure involved thus an immense counting of holes and a careful selection among them. That would have been, it seemed to him, a brave enough process, were it not the very nature of the holes, so to invite, to solicit, to persuade, to practice positively 1,000 lures and deceits. That's the end of James. One historical existential trace has been hunted, captured, guarded, preserved in aversion to waste by an avid collector, then shut carefully away outside an economy of use, inaccessible to touch. Now it is reanimated, recollected, through an encounter with the mind of a common reader, a researcher, an antiquarian, a bibliomaniac, a sub-librarian, a poet. Each collected object or manuscript is a pre-articulate, empty theater where a thought may surprise itself at the instant of seeing, where a thought may hear itself see. For conversion, there must be a mysterious leap of love. Sometimes a hidden verso side acts as prior counterpoint, the way improvised children's tales have needlepoint roots in Latin holy words and medieval jargon. What difference does it make if what we see before our mind's eye has already been interpreted? This meanly magnificent waste exists on a scale beyond actual use. It provides us with a literal and mythical sense of life hereafter. Coming home to poetry, you permit yourself liberties. In the first place, happiness. On August 19, 1926, Hart Crane ended a letter to Waldo Frank this way: I've never been able to live completely in my work before. Now it is to learn a great deal, to handle the beautiful skeins of this myth of America, to realize suddenly, as I seem to, how much of the past is living under only slightly altered forms, even in machinery and such like, is extremely exciting. So I'm having the time of my life just now, anyway. My 1971 edition of Webster's Third International Dictionary defines skein, a knot or number of knots of thread, silk, or yarn, a loosely coiled length of yarn or thread wound in a reel suitable for a process as dyeing or for sale as knitting wool or embroidery. Something suggesting the twistings and contradictions of a skein unraveled this tangled skein of evidence. A trimmed strip of osier made from splits for basket work. A metal thimble on an axletree arm. A flock of wildfowl in flight. Words are skeins, meteors, mimetic spirit sparks. Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, first published in 1828, is repeatedly invoked by our 19th century North American interpreters, Emerson, Melville, Hawthorne, Dickinson, Whitman, and many others. Often his definitions read as blank verse. Edward Dickinson's copy of the first edition was in the family library, and Emily Dickinson herself owned an 1844 reprint of the 1841 edition. Noah Webster, with her grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, was one of the founders of Amherst College, and her father was on the board of the Amherst Academy, the coeducational primary school she attended, and where for a time Webster served as president pro tem of the school board. In 1862, she told Thomas Wentworth Higginson, "When a little girl, I had a friend who taught me immortality, but venturing too near himself, he never returned. Soon after, my tutor died, and for several years, my lexicon was my only companion." Noah Webster, stitch, verb transitive. 1, to sew with a back puncture of the needle so as to double the thread, as to stitch a waistband. To sew or unite together as to stitch the leaves of a book and form a pamphlet. 2, to form land into ridges, New England. To stitch up, to mend or unite with a needle and thread, as to stitch up a rent, to stitch up an artery. Running over affinities and relations, as I believe was her practice, Dickinson could discover on the previous STI page of her lexicon companion the definition for STICH, pronounced stick, noun, 1, in poetry, a verse of whatever measure or number of feet. Stick is used in numbering the books of Scripture. 2, in rural affairs, an order or rank of trees. In New England, as much land as lies between double furrows is called a stick or land. Noah Webster constantly puts New England into his dictionary. Or she could skip down a few words on the same pages to stickomancy, the divination of lines or passages of books taken at hazard. After Dickinson's death, this note was found among her papers. What a hazard an accent is. When I think of the hearts it is scuttled or sunk, I almost fear to lift my hand to as much as a punctuation. Quotations are lines or passages seized at hazard from piled up cultural treasures. A quotation exerts a finite particular inflection in advance. Cut or closely teased out as if with a needle, it can interrupt the continuous flow of a poem, a tapestry, a picture, an essay, or a lecture like this one. The search is a poet for his language, to collate with the language of the noise of the falls, which seems in itself to be a language which we were and are still seeking. Between 1946 and 1958, William Carlos Williams labored over the work he conceived as a long poem in 4 parts. He eventually completed 5, and at the end of his life had started on a 6th. The 5 were published by New Directions in separate limited editions, my favorite, Book 3, The Library, 1949. He later said that in Patterson he wanted to, quote, use, quote, the multiple facets which a city presented as representatives for comparable facets of contemporary thought, thus to be able to objectify the man himself as we know him and love him and hate him. I deliberately selected Patterson as my reality, unquote. Once he had fixed on the city, he needed to gather and collect facts in relation to the place, especially to the Passaic River and its falls, from libraries, local and otherwise. Wallace Stevens began his preface to Williams' collected poems, 1921 through 1931, this way, quote, there are so many things to say about him. The first is that he is a romantic poet. This will horrify him, unquote. And the preface did absolutely horrify Williams. He was talking about it 30 years later. This is Stevens again. Yet the proof is everywhere. In Rubbings of Reality, the Briarcliff Quarterly, 46, Stevens added, Williams is a writer to whom writing is the grinding of a glass, the polishing of a lens by means of which he hopes to be able to see clearly. His delineations are trials. They are rubbings of reality. The German pietists of the early 1700s, who came to Pennsylvania to live in the caves of the Wissahickon and to dwell in solitude and meditation, were proceeding in their way from the chromatic to the clear. Is not Williams, in a sense, a literary pietist, chastening himself incessantly along the Passaic? Rigor of beauty is the quest, is the first sentence of the preface to Patterson, Book 1. This romantic literary pietist, named for his city, must unravel skeins of evidence in order to find beauty locked in the mind. The quest leads him to the library. Here Patterson, the poet, rifles through old newspapers and local histories with their genteel accounts of community celebrations, picnics, suicides, politics, extracts from popular and scientific thinking. Slang, sense observations, anthologies, analogies, intensely lyrical passages, a concatenation of contrasting vibratory forces. Rhetoric balances the scale of law and magic with spontaneous particulars of sound. Reading Patterson reminds me of walking barefoot across a small strip of common land near my house that's littered with beach glass, broken oyster shells, razor clams, and kelp. It's called a beach, but no one swims there because even at high tide, what is euphemistically referred to as sand too quickly becomes marl, mud, and marsh grass. I feel the past vividly here. My own memories and the deeper past I like to explore in poems. As I look across Long Island Sound, I can imagine it as open ocean. Oh, thalassa, the lash and hiss of water, the sea, how near it was to them. Soon, too soon. In 2014, Guilford is almost a suburb. The other day, driving home from New Haven, listening to NPR in the car radio, I heard suburbs described as places successful people flee from now, so increasingly only the poor and the old are left. At the end of Book 3, the wadded library, once Patterson's hoped-for sanctuary, is muffled and dead. It disappoints. Are libraries suburbs? For many years, I taught and lived in Buffalo, another hard-up, provincial, northeastern, or easternmost Midwestern Rust Belt city, with a crueler Niagara River and its larger, more dramatic falls. But it wasn't until I recently returned to give a reading that I actually visited the original documents that went into forming Book 3, now housed in the University Library's poetry collection. Here I encountered the actual preliminary rubbings of reality, typed and retyped drafts and collected newspaper clippings Dr. Williams used as fuel for the fire of poetic artifice. Whirling flames leaping from house to house, building to building, carried by the wind. The library is in their path. Beautiful thing, a flame. A defiance of authority burnt Sappho's poems, burned by intention, or are they still hid in the Vatican crypts? Beauty is a defiance of authority, for they were unwrapped fragment by fragment from outer mummy cases of papier-mâché inside Egyptian sarcophagi. Niagara Falls and the Great Falls of the Passaic River. Names are supposed to be signs for things, but what if things are actually the signs of names? What if words possess a spirit potential to their nature as words? Then things of experience in their passage between languages might materialize into posthumous vowel notes whipped up with shifting consonantal impact until by a sidestep or little jump, the embroidered manifestation of an earlier vernacular reflects authority, Edenic justice, through ciphered wilderness and pang. Poet, are you there? Prescription, prefatory writing, order, rule. The establishment of a claim of title to something under common law by virtue of immemorial use. A written direction for the preparation, compounding, and administration of a medicine. Name, age, address, date, telephone. When we were children playing games of hide and seek, the person chosen to be it, now turned round, alone and counting, was supposed to keep looking, in spite of snares and false resemblances. Ask the librarian behind the desk for a cardboard box of labeled file folders containing singular, whispering skeletons. Place one in my looking glass hands. As such, the sweet white locust tree at heavy cost. This consecrated branch transmits to posterity the benefits of seeds or buds hidden in trees for thousands of years. 1835, Nathaniel Hawthorne, young Goodman Brown. Faith, shouted Goodman Brown in a voice of agony and desperation. And the voices of the forest mocked him, crying, faith, faith, as if bewildered wretches were seeking her all through the wilderness. I couldn't believe it when I found this Edwards booklet in relation to Hawthorne's story. I was just amazed. Previous work I have done in terms of manuscripts and archives led me to the massive collection of the papers of the 18th century New England theologian, some say our first American philosopher, Jonathan Edwards, in New Haven at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. The Beinecke was constructed from Vermont marble and granite, bronze and glass during the early 1960s. The structure displays and contains acquisitive violence, the rapacious fetching involved in collecting. On the other hand, it radiates a sense of peace. Downstairs in the modernist reading room, I hear the purr of the air filtration system, the rippling sound of pages turning, singular out-of-tune melodies of computers rebooting. Scholars are seated at wide work tables bent in devotion over some particular material object. They could be copying out a manuscript or deciphering a pattern. Here is deep memory's lure and sheltering. In this room, I experience enduring relations and connections between what was and what is. Beinecke's vast collection of Edwards' family memorabilia contains letters, diaries, notebooks, essays, and more than 1,200 sermons, most of them in minuscule script. Jonathan Edwards was the only son among 10 unusually tall sisters their minister father jokingly referred to as his 60 feet of daughters. Their mother, Esther Stoddard Edwards, also known for her height, taught her 11 children and others in Northampton in a school that consisted of a downstairs room in their farmhouse. Later, they received the same education Timothy provided to local boys in his parish in East Windsor, Connecticut. The girls were tutored along with their brother. In some cases, they tutored him in theology, philosophy, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, history, grammar, and mathematics. They attended finishing school in Boston. But almost all that remains from this 18th century family's impressive tradition of female learning are a bedsheet probably woven by his mother, a tiny blue fragment of his wife Sarah Pierpont Edwards' wedding dress, a journal kept by Esther Edwards Burr, Jonathan and Sarah's older daughter, and several raggedy scraps from his younger sister Hannah's private writings. I remember the summer before my sister Jerusha's death, and I was leaning over the south fence and thinking in this manner that I was never likely to do better, and where should I go, etc. The folio-sized double leaves Jonathan, Sarah, and his 10 tall sisters wrote on were often homemade, hand-stitched from linen rags, salvaged from worn-out clothing, sometimes on scraps left over from dress patterns. Lists, sermons, quotations of psalms, dissonant scripture clusters are pressed between coarse cardboard covers with frayed edges. The rag paper color has grown deeper and richer in some. Wrote the Romans. On the other hand, world, I used to be felt soft, or in a sort, hardly knew who or what I was, and thereby the music, and therefore lost, I was. Consulted with myself about it. Harmony continues to exist through fact and experience, though there is no reason why it should. Nor is there any proof you can read back to the notion of one mind's inner relation with nature's vibratory hum. Lyric poets can't move heaven and earth in order to say things language separates from music, through yearning, muted rhythmic pulse, through stepwise voice motion. 3 of Edward's manuscript books I particularly love are titled Efficacious Grace. 2 of them he constructed from discarded semicircular pieces of silk paper his wife and daughters used for making fans. If you open these small oval volumes and just look without trying to decipher the minister's spidery script, pen strokes begin to resemble textile thread text. Surface and meaning cooperate to keep alive in one process, mastery in service, service in mastery. Sheer verbal artistry can be a force for mercy. I've always been drawn to Edwards, even his fire-eating sermons, where each judging word has its particular cell, especially the notorious Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, a sermon preached at Enfield, July 8, 1741, at a time of great awakenings, with its chilling epigraph from Deuteronomy 32. Their foot shall slide in due time. Might be a message to us right now. Because he understands the way in which single words and sentence clusters directly affect involuntary memory. Involuntary memory is lucid, preverbal, soothing. Hit or miss an arrow into the heart of loving. One day, by chance, I opened a folder titled Wetmore Hannah Edwards' Diary in the hand of her daughter, Lucy Wetmore Whittlesey. Inside was a copy of the private writings of Jonathan's sister. Lucy's late 18th century italic script, much easier to read than her uncle and her mother's earlier handwriting, begins in media res with an excerpt from Psalm 55:6. Oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. The visual and acoustic shock of that first exclamatory "oh" on paper brown with age made me think in a rush of Henry James' great novel, The Wings of the Dove, and the beauty of the King James version of the 55th Psalm in relation to its wide use in this novel where James so perfectly finds his form for work that will follow. The fictional orphaned American heiress, Millie Thiel, quote, stricken and doomed, condemned to die under short respite, while also enamored of the world, unquote, is based on James's American cousin, Minnie Temple, whose early death he feeds on as an artist. In 1914, at the end of his long writing career, James closed the second volume of his memoirs, Notes of a Son and Brother. William had died in 1910. With a chapter built around extracts from letters Minnie had written to their mutual friend, John Chipman Gray, shortly before her death 44 years earlier. Chapter 13 ends with this paragraph. Death at the last was dreadful to her. She would have given anything to live. And the image of this, which was to remain long with me, appeared so of the essence of tragedy that I was in the far-off aftertime to seek to lay the ghost by wrapping it, a particular occasion aiding, in the beauty and dignity of art. Much as this cherished companion's presence among us had represented for William and myself, and it is on his behalf I specially speak, her death made a mark that must stand here for a too-waiting conclusion. We felt it together as the end of our youth, unquote. Psalm 68:13. The wings of a dove covered with silver, its pinions of fine gold. James heavily doctored the originals Gray had provided. Then he destroyed them. He also left out the extraordinary letters she sent both to himself and to William, the brother he said he was speaking for. Before sending Minnie's correspondence across the ocean, William James' widow, Alice Howe Gibbons James, and their daughter Mary Margaret carefully transcribed the originals in longhand. At some point, these copies were deposited in 4 folders at Houghton Library, where Habicher discovered them during the 1980s while he was working on The Father, A Life of Henry James Sr. M. Temple, present as absent, the imaginary friend known to be imaginary, but impossible to let go. Her initials play their part as reflectors in The Wings of the Dove, 1902. 5 years later, in The Question of Our Speech, an address to the graduating class at Bryn Mawr College, Henry James told the assembled audience, quote, "All our employment of constituted sounds, syllables, sentences comes back to the way we say a thing, and it is very largely by saying all the while that we live and play our parts," unquote. Then how do I pronounce the last name of his fictive figure in The Gilded Coach as she comes forth? A teal is a small, wild, freshwater fowl. Its flesh is food for hunters. But James has seeded the word with the spectral grapheme H, and the plant, wrapped in the dignity of art, has grown so that when I read THEALE on the page and say it aloud to myself, this aspirate puff of breath co-implicates his fictional birdwoman with wealth, theatricality, and death. Where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. THEALE reflects the orthography of John Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, where frequent diagraphs EA and TH flourish as letter spirits. I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. When I read Minnie Temple's letters, so artfully arranged to form the climax of Notes of a Son and Brother, the last letters of the orphan poet, also stricken and doomed, condemned to die under short respite, serve as images or shadows. Up from the mystic play of shadows, Walt Whitman, walking along Long Island's North Shore at Beinecke, listens to a migratory seabird pouring forth meanings in measureless measures, whereto answering the sea, delaying not, hurrying not, whispered me through the night and very plainly before daybreak, lisped to me the low and delicious word, death, and again death, 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 death. THEALE leads to the limit of breath. The grapheme H, breath's last letter remnant, hangs suspended somewhere in ether, like an Absalom by his hair. Alice James' copy of the last letter Minnie wrote to Gray on February 16, 1870, she died on March 8th, ends this way. I feel the greatest longing for summer or spring. I think I would like it to be always spring for the rest of my life, and to have all the people I care for always with me, and never speak of going away. But who wouldn't like it so? Goodbye, write soon. I hope you are successful with your lectures. I should like to hear you give them. Are respectable spinsters allowed? Always affectionately yours, Mary Temple. Itself not so. Into the light eye touch its judge's face, but not yet had the pin. In 1905, 2 years after finishing The Wings of the Dove, James returned to America after a 20-year absence. Recalling his visit in the American Scene, 1906, the section titled Cambridge and Harvard, he described catching sight of Gray, and Gray is the famous lawyer, author, of John Chipman Gray and the rule against perpetuities. The rule against perpetuities is his, which I think is ironic. Recalling his visit in the American scene, the section titled Cambridge and Harvard, he described catching sight of Gray. I went into the new law library, immense and supreme, in the shadow of which I caught myself sniffling the very dust, prehistoric but still pungent, of the old. I saw in the distance a distinguished friend, all alone, belatedly working there. But to go to him, I should have had to cross the bridge that spans the gulf of time. And with a suspicion of weak places, I was nervous about its bearing me. Had the wings of a dove, but whether could I fly o'er and abiding portion and no ring deceiving enjoyments, where shall I find real? I wander from mountain. Oh, that I could rest for the soul of my weary myself too. In research libraries and special collections, words and objects come into their own and have their place again. This known world, this exact moment, a little afterwards, not quite. Walking just below my father's orchard after, religion and the concerns of my soul, my business, religion and the concerns of my soul, my business, strayed for and labored after an awakening sense of. Most of my writing life has been spent in Connecticut, not far from where Hannah Edwards Wetmore lived and wrote. Reading her private writings, I experienced through an occult invocation of verbal links and forces, the qualities peculiar to our seasonal changing light and color. It's a second kind of knowledge, tender, tangled, violent, august, and various. The as yet moon wrench hang poised rift and air, nor hadrow at the far reaches land and or swim and flew of things, odds fluck. Early November evening with frost forecast. The sight of a bare bough caught by streetlight outside my window. Electric. False beauty and confined beauty. Relict. Names shelter us under the wings of first creation. Hannah's first name begins and ends with the aspirate phoneme H. Spectral letter H. Occult, quick thought, reached through the fire of art. To reach is to touch. Poetry has no proof, nor plan, nor evidence by decree or in any other way. From somewhere in the twilight realm of sound, a spirit of belief flares up at the point where meaning stops, and the unreality of what seems most real floods over us. The inward ardor I feel while working in research libraries is intuitive. It's a sense of self-identification and trust, or the granting of grace in an ordinary room in a secular time. Thanks. Thank you.
We thought we might take a few minutes of questions and then allow you to all commune together. Does anyone have a question? And Chloe will be circulating with the microphone.
No.
There's
I mean,
also
I don't
no...
know if it were, if, my whole thing is, does this work with collaging, making you make connections? you know, I have it all strictly connected, but of course you're different. You don't, you know, you have your own way of connecting, and I don't, I think PowerPoint is a real interesting thing because it looks thrilling on the screen when you're at your computer and you look at that PowerPoint and it's all brilliant. Then you get it up in the screen and it's all sort of too big and it's not the same color and it's, you know what I mean? And I think that's a problem. I mean, I think more and more people are going to be using and thinking in terms of visual images. And the difference between the computer and the PowerPoint is a big difference. Sort of interesting. I don't know. Anybody has anything to say about that? Yes.
I just wondered how long you were collecting all the images.
Well, it's over years that I've used these various summer, like when I was working on Peirce, which, by the way, now is, you can look at his wonderful doodles and rebuses. Harvard's put them online, but they hadn't when I was first working on it. And for years and years and years and years, I was working on Dickinson manuscripts. So, you know, a lot of years. and then, but to put it together into one cohesive lecture and to get the images, that was about 2 years. 2 years. Yeah.
To answer your question, does it work? Yes. This works beautifully, and thank you so much. I wanted to ask a question about this in the context of your earlier work, many years of work. It felt, and I'm just hearing this for the first time, it felt as if the ideas of the beautiful and of death were in a different relationship to each other in this work. And I wonder if that's the case, and if so, if you wanted to say anything about that.
Well, as I'm getting old. I'm old, so I'm sort of near that point. And the older I get, the more intensely I feel that about beauty. And I don't know how to describe it, but oh God, what am I going to say? I mean, that beauty is truth, beauty, and that's all there is. That's all you need to know. I mean, that's sort of and Whitman. I mean, I just think, you know, late Whitman, Night, Death and the Stars, the simplicity. I mean, I think a certain kind of romanticism has gone these days. It's all irony, and I'm sort of, and also I have a thing about the poet. I sort of come from a generation, that kind of Williams, Olson, or where the idea of a poet is a kind of epic, you know, it's a calling, it's a company, and it's a divine calling, and it's sacred. There's a sacred aspect to it. I mean, Stevens is just my poet. I adore Stevens. And late, I mean, I think that's, it's the supreme fiction. And so somehow it's hard for a woman to be in that tradition, which really is a male tradition. And so how do you, what is that about? The absences, the gaps. That's why the discovering this journal but also I've been working with this composer David Grubbs, and working with him has pulled me towards a kind of sense of the acoustic, which I had in my early work, but a fractured sense that is, I think, beautifully speaks to what I feel about the sort of woman who is in this tradition where there really aren't women, a kind of fracture and interruption and space, and trying to match that in sound and the pure sight of just letters, which is all we have. Trees that lack, until trees that lack the intelligence of trees. That line of Stevens is just in the River of Rivers in Connecticut. I just can't, it's mind-blowing. And trees that lack the intelligence of trees. Do you think?
No, thanks. I don't have a question, but I really loved you. I never experienced you reading your own poems, and this was great to see them, to hear you, and so this is the shape, the vision, and the acoustics, because you just said it with the acoustics, and then I thought, oh, we don't know how the others would read their, you know.
Oh, I know.
Yeah,
That's true.
and so the
No, I
rhythm,
know.
and this was really an entry to your. Because I have seen your poems, but I've never heard them, and this was great.
Well,
Thanks.
of course, then you won't, I read them one way, and in a certain way they are unreadable, but I'm fascinated by the idea of acoustic sound and sight being one thing. And working on the late manuscripts of Emily Dickinson, of course, I mean, I don't know how to express or where you finally see it in this book, The Gorgeous Nothings. What was it? What was she reaching at? What are those late fragments? Are they sound, sight, music? They're all one thing, but is it possible to do one thing? I don't, that's the sort of mystery.
I'd like to end on that word mystery.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Okay.